On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
But the figure of the American Jew becomes sort of a symbol of the temporarily protected class under the Trump administration. They don't want diversity, equity, and inclusion for other minority groups. We are allowed to have those programs for Jewish students.
Hi, I'm Phoebe Maltz Bovy, opinion editor of the Canadian Jewish News. You're listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the CJN that looks at the complicated place of Jews in today's cultural and political landscapes. So as regular listeners or people who follow me online in any capacity may have picked up on, I have, for the most part, traded Twitter, now called X, for the platform Blue Sky. Like all social media platforms, it has its ups and downs, but one definite up has been following an account called Joel S., who is Joel Swanson. He is a professor of religion at Sarah Lawrence College, as well as a public intellectual. And the reason for having him on is partly just I've really enjoyed what he posts, and also because of his March article in Slate called "What Are We Allowed to Say? How Trump's Department of Education has made it harder for me to teach Jewish studies." That piece brings up a number of themes listeners to this podcast will be familiar with. And yes, sorry, it is a bit more Americana, I realize, on a Canadian podcast, but as we're trying to think through a lot of these issues in Canada about where sort of Jews and DEI, all of these things are still very active discussions in Canada in ways that are quite different from how they are in the US. I think looking at sort of what would happen in this alternate universe where some people in the Jewish community, certainly not all, are requesting, and then some would happen, would that be a better world or not? We have a case study right there in the US. So Joel Swanson, welcome to the Jewish Angle.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. It's great to be here.
So first, I want to know about you. I have enjoyed your posts. I read your bio on the Sarah Lawrence website, and I was like, oh my goodness, we have a lot of research interests in common and things like this. I saw that your dissertation was on, quote, an array of little-studied Francophone Jewish writers and philosophers in the pre-war period. And I was like, that is extremely interesting to me as somebody who did a not dissimilar dissertation, but on the 19th century. So just, do you want to tell me a bit about how you got into your academic field, but also how you came to have also a public intellectual role?
My academic background is primarily in modern Jewish thought, broadly construed. And one of the reasons that I like modern Jewish thought is that as a discipline, it's sort of broadly philosophical, but in a way that engages the political situation of Jews in the modern period and the backdrop of Jewish emancipation and debates about Jewish identity, and how is Jewish identity going to be defined against the backdrop of modern nation states in Europe in particular? Is it going to be defined as a religious identity? Is it going to be defined as a cultural or national identity? And debates about what it even means to be a Jewish person that still, I think, resonate today. We're still grappling with what it actually means to be a Jew, and how do the religious and the national elements of that identity relate to one another or conflict with one another. And so I guess through my academic studies, I got asked to write some articles for the Forward, sort of bringing my academic background into debates about Jewish identity, particularly with the first Trump administration and certain controversies that were going on during the first Trump administration about ways of defining Jewish identity in particular, and a policy adopted by President Trump during his first term, in which he identified anti-Jewish discrimination as a form of anti-national form of nationality-based racism for the first time. So Jews as a group in the United States were identified as a nationality and not just as a religious group under U.S. law for the
very
first time.
Clermont-Tonnerre, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, which I'm sure
sort
all of our listeners get that reference.
So sort of the reverse of that.
Yes.
So for those who might not know, Clermont-Tonnerre was a sort of liberal-minded member of the French aristocracy during the French Revolution who was debating the question of whether Jews in France should be given equal citizenship as Christians in France, and primarily Catholics for the first time in French history under post-revolutionary French government. And essentially his argument was that Jews should be given equal citizenship rights if they abandoned an identity as a political group. So whereas previously Jews saw themselves as sort of a separate entity, a group that governed themselves like a nation, so to speak, with their own laws, their own folkways, their own customs, this French noble said, well, Jews can be equal to French Catholics under French law, but only if they say, well, our Jewish identity is just something we do in private. It's not something that we govern ourselves according to Jewish law. And the famous quote that constantly gets recited in Jewish studies is, we must deny everything to the Jews as a nation. We must grant everything to the Jews as people. So he wanted to say, essentially, Jews should just be the same as other French people and should just do their Jewish things in private, in their own homes and in their own synagogues, but they should not be governed according to Jewish law in the public sphere. They should accept the supremacy of French law in the public sphere. And so what the Trump administration was saying was essentially sort of the reverse of that in some ways, that they should be defined as a national group and as a group that is not just a religious group as they had been defined in the past under American law for the purposes of anti-discrimination, but that Jews should be seen as a nationality as well as a religious identity.
That's why that quote jumped out at me so much when you said that. I hadn't even realized that Trump had done that. He's done so many things. That one passed me by. While we're on the topic of sort of historical analogies, I know when we were discussing this podcast previously, I brought up the Dreyfus affair, and you said you had something to say on why it's relevant now. So why do you see the Dreyfus affair? That's when the French army officer Alfred Dreyfus was wrongfully convicted of treason for anti-Semitic and other, but mainly anti-Semitic reasons. Anyway, at the end of the 19th, early 20th century France, what is its, and it split French society. How do you see it as relevant?
This past semester, I did a lecture about the Dreyfus affair in my modern Jewish history survey class. And the question that I got repeatedly from my undergraduate students was they agreed that it was a miscarriage of justice and that obviously Dreyfus had been mistreated by the justice system. But they kept asking, well, why was this one person, no matter how obviously it was a miscarriage of justice, why did this one case sort of divide all of French society? Why was this one person so important for an entire decade in French political and cultural life, basically? And what I tried to say in response to that was that arguably it wasn't really about Dreyfus at all. He was just sort of a symbol for these larger debates about the place of religion and the legacy of the French Revolution, and whether the French government should be primarily secular or whether religious influences should be allowed back into the French government. And he became essentially a sort of symbol of all of these larger debates about the legacy of the French Revolution and French republicanism in its broad sense. And so obviously a lot of famous intellectuals and writers and professors and scholars publicly involved themselves in that debate. But the most famous, of course, is Émile Zola, the famous French language literary figure associated
the one
with the school of...
with the J'accuse.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
The J'accuse piece, which has become so iconic in French culture that you still see people use the phrase J'accuse completely out of that context.
I was going to say more than French culture. I've seen it in like New York Times op-eds. I mean, J'accuse, I think, is like colloquial sort of Yeah, I think it's just in the vernacular, even in English. I was thinking, though, in terms of that, this is interesting that, like, why one person? I mean, you could say the same of, like, George Floyd, right? It's often
Yes, absolutely.
one person is representative of something bigger, and it's not obviously it wasn't that Zola was, like, specifically a pal of Dreyfus's, yeah, it was obviously about something bigger.
Well, the interesting thing about Zola is that he actually, by all accounts, didn't really care that much about anti-Semitism or Jews one way or the other. He didn't really care about this issue because he thought that one Jewish army captain had faced such a miscarriage of justice. Rather, he was sort of a broad political liberal in the sense that he supported a non-religious French government where people would have equal rights under the law. And he saw defending Zola as sort of an opportunity to involve himself in this public debate. So for Dreyfus rather
Right.
was rather just an opportunity for this. And so he became actually representative of this new figure of the intellectual in France. And if you actually read French newspapers during the period after Zola's J'accuse article, you see a dramatic rise in the number of French newspapers actually using the word intellectuel, the
Right.
intellectual. So in some ways, he becomes the sort of paradigmatic figure of what it actually means to be a public intellectual at all, and to be someone who is known first and foremost as an artist, as a writer, but who then involves himself in the affairs of the state in a big way.
Right. I mean, what's interesting with the Dreyfus affair also is I think my recollection is that for Zola and other such figures, especially just like, and just generally on the French left, that like this was kind of the Dreyfus affair was this moment of kind of purging its own anti-Semitism, that there had been a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment on obviously not only the French left, also on the French right, but that was this kind of moment when it was like because I remember this is from my ancient times in grad school, that like I remember learning that basically there had been at first this kind of like, well, and this will seem very current. It was like, well, Dreyfus is a privileged guy, so who cares, right? His privilege is showing, whatever. But like,
Yeah.
but at the same time, like, not so privileged once you're in Devil's Island. And then I think there was this kind of move to reject anti-Semitism. Obviously didn't always stick. And then, you can move up to like 1940 is a whole different thing. But I wanted to talk about your Slate piece because there's a historical analogy in there that I would not have thought of. The Dreyfus affair I think about a lot, but this was one I had not thought of, about court Jews. Because you make an analogy in this piece in Slate to court Jews as sort of what Trump seems to be going for. And it is a useful way of making sense of an administration whose so-called fight against anti-Semitism is at odds with what most American Jews, who, as we have established many times on this podcast, and anybody can Google it, American Jews tend to vote Democrat, including these recent elections, seek. But it also makes sense if you're trying to figure out what Trump's doing. When he sort of says he's acting in the interest of Jews, he means the Jews who support him, who are not representative of American Jews, forget global, but like just even American Jews generally. I mean, so I thought that was interesting. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the court Jews analogy?
Yes. So that's an analogy that I found very useful to make. So broadly speaking, the figure of the court Jew in medieval and early modern Europe was essentially a financier, a financial figure, a Jewish, and there's no way to say this without sort of referencing ugly and difficult stereotypes.
Well, there is. I think there is a reason. There is a way, which is to say most Jews were not that thing. Most were just poor.
Absolutely. Most Jews were not that. But the court Jew was, by definition, someone who was involved in banking and in finance and provided financial services to the Christian ruling class, to the kings and other lords and dukes and other nobles around Europe. And in exchange for providing those services, they were given temporary protection, whereas other Jews might be persecuted. The court Jew was temporarily able to achieve a degree of greater security. But what's important there is that it was always temporary. If fortunes changed and if the sovereign, if the king or the lord needed a scapegoat, then this powerful Jewish financial figure became a convenient icon of that scapegoat role. So it was a position that temporarily could provide some greater degree of security, but it was always provisional and always something that was tenuous in nature. And why I found it useful as a comparison today is that it seems that the Trump administration is using American Jews. And I use American Jew deliberately because I know that this is a Canadian podcast and the debates are different in Canada, naturally. But the figure of the American Jew becomes sort of a symbol of the temporarily protected class under the Trump administration. So whereas the Trump administration is saying that they don't want diversity, equity, and inclusion, so-called DEI initiatives for other minority groups, whether that's the Black community or Latino Americans or Native Americans, we are allowed to have those programs for Jewish students. So just for instance, you see in the settlement that the Trump administration recently signed with Columbia University, a very high profile settlement where Columbia agreed to pay a fine to the federal government in exchange for having their research funding restored. They agreed to ban DEI programs for, broadly speaking, for most groups on campus that might be described as minority groups, but they're also required to have a figure in the administration who would play that role for Jewish students, who would specially represent Jewish students on campus and essentially regulate, sort of serve as an ombudsman to the Jewish students for cases of anti-Semitism on campus. But so you could have that for Jews on campus, but they were not permitted to have a similar role for other students who might feel they're facing bigotry.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
So you write about the Trump administration banning, quote, implicit bias training for students, but making an exception for anti-Semitism. And you write, and I'm quoting your Slate piece here, not only does this separate Jews from other groups with which we might stand in solidarity, but it makes it impossible to educate students about the actual forms that anti-Semitism today takes, end quote. So I agree that this double standard is bizarre. I agree that it's ultimately bad for Jewish students who are getting this special treatment they didn't ask for. I think this could contribute to anti-Semitism. I don't think this is a good thing. And certainly, as I've said before, and will keep saying, and even though people are going to say, nobody who signed the Harper's letter says this, I say this constantly, the Trump administration should not be like rounding people up off the street, like, you know, foreign national students for having written an op-ed or something like that, or protesting. No.
Sure.
I'm against all this. I've said this since it started. I'm, a liberal Jew in Toronto, like obviously, whatever. But I do want to push back a little bit on your characterization of DEI as a quote, right-wing boogeyman, because the oppression hierarchy, so this is where my own sort of non-academic background is in. I wrote a book about privilege accusations. It came out in 2017.
Yes, I read your book. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. You are one of the 3 people who read it, and I'm honored. But the oppression hierarchy, though, as understood in the 2010s and really through the Biden years, didn't include Jews as a marginalized group reliably. Sometimes it was complicated, depends which privilege checklist you were doing. And it did sometimes even involve this idea of Jews as hyper-privileged, as epitomizing privilege, as somehow more white privileged than other white people and all of this. And this has been ongoing for years, or else I could not have written about it in something that came out in 2017. But it really did come to a head during these campus encampment protests when some students, some Jewish students complained using language of like safe spaces and so forth. So we agree that Trump's approach is wrong. But also, I guess what I'm saying is like there was a there. What Trump's doing, I don't think is addressing it. But like what should be happening, I guess is what I'm asking.
So it's a really important question. And I think that one of the challenges of the Trump administration's approach to campus anti-Semitism and to anti-Semitism more broadly is that he would not have been able to have as much success as he has had if not for the fact that there is a very real issue there. And I don't deny that there is anti-Semitism on American college and university campuses. There absolutely
And do you include,
is.
and by when you say that, do you only mean like because some students and faculty support Trump, or do you mean because there's anti-Semitism across the political spectrum in different ways?
I mean, because there's anti-Semitism across the political spectrum. There are absolutely people, while I don't agree at all with the entire characterization of the pro-Palestine student movements that you hear from the administration, I certainly have seen students make statements about Jewish identity that are very uninformed, that are insensitive, or make statements that seem to be endorsing violence against Israeli Jews. And I find that highly objectionable. And I will say that I find that objectionable. And I will continue to say that even while I find the Trump administration's approach to it
But just specifically the
unhelpful.
DEI thing, like what should be happening there?
Well, so it's interesting that you say that because so the state of California, a number of years ago, they passed a statewide bill that required that students in public high school in the state of California would be required to take classes in what is called ethnic studies. And ethnic studies encompasses a lot of different ranges of studies. You could study Chicano studies about the Latino community. You could study Native American studies in high school. So there were a variety of ways that students could fulfill that requirement. And when the bill was first written, there was a lot of pushback from Jewish groups about the fact that the ethnic studies curriculum did not seem to include the study of Jews and Jewish history as part of this process. And in particular, there was pushback about the fact that the Middle Eastern studies component of this ethnic curriculum seemed to erase Jews who come from the Middle East and North Africa, Mizrahi Jewish communities. But while there was general agreement, except from some dissident Jews on the left, that there were problems with the curriculum, there were big debates about what to do about it. There were some who said, well, this is evidence that this entire approach to ethnic studies needs to be thrown out. But then there were other groups who said, well, no, we actually like the idea of requiring students to study a minority community in high school. We just want, for instance, Mizrahi Jews to be included as an option in that. So there was a big debate about whether the approach to this problem should be to sort of toss out the entire framework or to revise the framework to make it more inclusive of Jewish experiences. And I think we see similar debates going on with DEI programs at a college level. And I absolutely agree that there are DEI administrators and DEI programs that have not necessarily been sensitive to Jewish experiences and that have dismissed the history of anti-Semitism.
I think it's that there was, like, because I live in two eras, right? Like I live in,
sure,
because I'm American and now Canadian, I can see it from the American perspective of like, but look, Trump's obviously suppressing speech in ways that, any sort of scold on Tumblr could never have imagined, yes, obviously that's happening. But right. I also see it as like, if not to say the past is another country and that country's Canada, but a little bit the past is another country, the recent past, and that country's Canada. And like, it's grim when Jews are being not just, discriminated against, but attacked. And there's this preset oppression hierarchy that says, no, Jews are the white oppressors, Jews are settlers, Jews are, all of this. And it's like, I think I agree that Trump's exploiting something, but I think what he's exploiting, maybe where we slightly disagree, is that I don't think he's exploiting like that there are a few anti-Semitic bad actors around the edges, which there are. But I think it's more that there's something like structural where Jews just are not not to say Jews don't count, because it's not, I don't even know that the answer is that Jews should count. It's more just that like it's the wrong framework for understanding anti-Semitism, maybe.
Well, so I guess this gets back to your critique of the entire framework of privilege. I do fundamentally think we need to reconceive the way we think about oppression itself, to stop thinking about it as static and to think about it as something that works on multiple levels, where someone's identity can be a source of privilege, so to speak, to use a problematic term in some cases, and also a source of being victimized in other cases. And I actually think that one of the cases that I try to make to my students at this very extremely left-wing liberal arts school where I teach, where most students identify as anti-Zionists, that's where I teach, and I have to try to engage them with that. One of the cases that I tried to make is actually that the conflictual status of Jews throughout modern history, where at times they're given equal citizenship in the state, at times that's taken away. Jews in the Middle East, you have briefly a period in French colonialism where they're given more rights under French colonialism than Muslims are, but then that's taken away when you have Arab nationalist movements. It actually points to the way in which identities are not static. They're always being reconceived and reimagined. And I do think that it is problematic on a deep level to conceive of oppression as something that's permanently hierarchical. And I hope that Jewish history gives us the sort of tools and historical lens to think about that in a different way, and to think about identity as something circumstantial and something that's always changing. And I have always pushed back against that idea that it is static, or that there are these permanent hierarchies.
I see that you're scheduled to teach a course called Are Jews White?
Yes.
Are you still able to do that in this new Trump era? Are you still going to be allowed to? And what are your thoughts, fears, hopes for that?
We had a meeting of the humanities faculty at my college last year where we were discussing what classes we were going to be offering this coming academic year. And I mentioned my Are Jews White ? Class. And one of the other faculty members who is not Jewish, he interjected and asked me, well, are they? Can you tell me? And I said, well, I can't give away the ending. You have to take the class to find out. But obviously, that's somewhat glib. The answer is that, well, are Jews white? Well, the point of the class is to suggest that the Jewish experience actually says something about the history of racialization itself, going back to, ideas of blood purity in the Spanish Inquisition and ways in which Jewish identity got redefined as something that could be passed down hereditarily, and suggest that the Jewish experience says something about how race itself always functions differently in different cultural settings. And that the question, ultimately, what I hope my students get out of that class is that the question, are Jews white, is the wrong question to ask, because no one really is white. It's about how we use that term contextually and in different cultural
And you're
settings.
still able to teach a course like this, like in Trump's America.
So the short answer is that I am a little worried about it. I am worried about people asking for my syllabus. We as a college have gotten subpoenaed by a committee of the United States Congress asking for certain materials. I am worried that they might ask for my syllabus for that class, and that I might have no choice but to hand it over, although I would try to resist that. At the same time, I have to give credit to my college administration. They have absolutely defended my right to teach that class as an academic freedom issue, and argued that that is a class that has intellectual value for students to take. And if I stop teaching that class, it would seem to me that the administration has won.
Well, I have a million more questions for you, but we don't have time, unfortunately. But Joel Swanson, where can people find you?
Blue Sky is the best way to keep up with things that I'm writing.
Professor Swanson, thank you so much for coming on The Jewish Angle.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you for listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. This has been Phoebe Maltz Bovy, opinion editor of the CJN and a contributing editor of Scribe Quarterly, the CJN's print magazine. The show is produced and edited by Michael Fraiman. Our music is by Frank Freeman. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to The Jewish Angle wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.